Thank you, Miriam. And I would like, first of all, to thank the Humboldt Institute for Internet Society and the Federal Agency for Civic Education for their kind invitation that allows me to be here with you tonight to exchange a number of ideas about the research I have been conducting in the last 5-6 years. And I really want to thank all of you for your interest and presence here through the cold night of Berlin. And I like particularly to be here with you tonight. And I can tell you the secret about why I answer immediately to Jeanette. I have a deep appreciation for Berlin in many ways. It's, among other things, now Berlin is widely considered one of the keynotes in intellectual, cultural, political innovation in Europe. And this is acknowledged, and this is one testimony to human resilience and to the ability to overcome the miseries of wars and states and bureaucracies to ultimately have this thriving culture in every aspect. To relax before the lecture, I spent a significant part of the night yesterday night at the Berliner Republic Cafe, which, as you know, is open until 5 a.m. And that confirmed my impressions of Berlin. I have been several times. But I have not been in the last 8 years, so there was about time to come back. Of course, my most significant experience in Berlin many years ago, I came to Berlin even at the time in which was a divided Berlin. But of course, the most significant experience in Berlin was in the early 1990s, when the moment in which still the GDR was there, but it was possible to cross the wall, and with a small group of friends, both Russian and German, we crossed the wall like 7 times in a row to make sure that that was possible. And that what seemed to be unthinkable was starting to create a wall that would unite rather than separate. And I was very moved by that experience. And since then on, I have been coming regularly. I presented in Berlin the German version of my trilogy on the information age a few years ago, and that continues to be part emotional, part intellectual interest to be somewhat, a little bit part of your society. As you know, or some people know, I spent much of my intellectual life in Berkeley, but now in Los Angeles, but still I spend more or less half of my time in Europe, mainly in my Barcelona, but also going to other places in Europe to feel the vitality of this cultural interaction. My lecture tonight will be relating...
Just for the last.
Sure. Thank you. You know, the only technology that never works is the sound technology in the lectures. So sometimes I decide to just throw away the micro and speak myself, since in my young age, I was an actor in theater, very close to sociologists. And then I speak with my own voice. But no, I trust German technology, so now I'm going to speak with some detail from here. So the topic of my lecture today, to some extent, is for me, the most important topic of the research I have been doing for quite a while. As some of this is in my book, Communication Power, but throughout the last 6 to 7 years, this has been my obsession, because power relationships are the foundational relationships of society. This has been my leitmotif throughout my entire career. Power. Why? Because those who are in power determine, shape the institutions and the norms that regulate our lives. So in that sense, power relationships are the foundational relations of society, are the DNA of societies. However, the interesting thing is that wherever there is power, there is always counterpower. And in that sense, my analysis is not an analysis of domination in the classic tradition of social sciences. It's always an analysis of domination, counter-domination, power relationships and resistance to this power, and the ability and the possibility for people whose values and interests are excluded from the institutions of society to voice their dissent and to attempt the change of the institutions that construct society. And in fact, our historical experience then and now is always determined by the interaction between power and counterpower, a relentless interaction. There is no social peace, sorry. Is an endless, constant interaction between the attempt to impose interests from the institutions and the attempt to change the institutions democratically or through different means to be able to introduce new values and new interests in the institutions of society. And therefore, the power has always been largely exercised through two main means. And this is also the way power has been conceptualized in the social sciences tradition. There are many forms of power, but fundamentally there are two major processes, institutions of power: coercive power, persuasive power. The power over the bodies, the power over the minds. Meaning, on the one hand, power in the Max Weber tradition as the monopoly of legitimate violence by the state. Well, I say the monopoly of violence, legitimate or not, over the state. That's really what has been considered the main form of power. But always has been another form of power, that is the capacity of shape minds to elicit the consensus of the subjects by the action of different centers of power in society, or at least the resignation of the subjects that that's the way it is and we cannot do much about it. This is a fundamental process of power which goes long tradition in the social sciences, Foucault, but also to some extent the notion of Gramsci about the hegemony in society that was related to this capacity to shape minds, to shape the way we think. However, again, this both coercive power and persuasive power can be resisted and is resisted, and people react against their inability to be able to go into the discourse and into the debate in ways that they are protagonists of the debate and that they reshape the debate. And again, so there is power and counterpower, there is coercive power and persuasive power in both cases. And in both cases, but particularly in persuasive power, all depends on information and communication. Information and communication had been the critical tools of power and the critical tools of counterpower throughout history. Why? Because through communication, people are connected. So if the process of communication is controlled by those who are in power, then the signals that people receive in their brains comes from a system of values, interests, symbols that are adapted to what the powerful think or would like that people think about themselves. And vice versa. The only way to change is when people who do not agree, do not accept the social order, communicate with other people who have similar attitudes and similar experience to, in my language, to reprogram the process of communication in terms of their own interests. And again, this communication system, this information retrieval system never ends and is in a constant dialectical relationship. However, information and communication are the key factors in the accumulation and distribution of wealth and power in society, and this is throughout history. And the actual processes that determine information and communication largely depend on specific technological paradigms, meaning communication is very different depending on the communication technologies and information technologies of each time. Could be the printing press, could be the church discourses from the church authorities, but throughout history, the distribution of pamphlets has been essential in any kind of revolution. So, in other words, the way we think doesn't depend only on ourselves or some abstract culture in a metaphysical sense. The way we think depends on the signals that we receive from others. So the connection between our neural networks and the communication networks on which any social activity is based. Now, and in that sense, technology does not determine, but is an essential medium of organizing communication and the interaction between our neural networks on the basis of communication networks. The fundamental transformation of our time is the advent of ubiquitous digital communication and information networks. A very good student of mine, a German actually, Martin Hilbert, an economist, finished his dissertation with me in Los Angeles in 2010 and published his summary of his dissertation in the journal Science, which is considered a standard of scientific research. And his dissertation was, for the first time, he calculated the entire information existing in the planet and the platforms in which, and countries and institutions in which this information was processed. He showed that 92% of all the information in the planet, measured in bytes, 92% was already digitized. Now the proportion is about 95, 96%. So we live in a planet in which almost entirely information is digitized, which allows, therefore, two things. Allows the existence of a common language of communication between different sets of information, and second, allows the ability of processing information, digital technologies, to recombine, to exchange, to move at high speed in terms of volume and complexity, the communication process. And how this is transmitted? Well, the other, just give me, it's not really data, it's illustration, is reminding you where we are in our society. Currently, this 92, 96% of digitized information, the overwhelming proportion is accessible by internet and wireless networks of communication. We have today 4 billion internet users in the world on a planet of 7.5. And we have 7 billion on a planet of 7.5 wireless communication numbers, not devices, not phones, subscribers, meaning numbers where you can call. Excluding children under the age of 3, although probably this is coming the moment where they have also their personal wireless number, that means that we have a planet which is entirely connected. Of course, with different technologies, different capacities, and particularly different cultural and educational capacities to use this communication. But we are connected. And in addition, we already have at this point 50% of the adult population of the world has a smartphone, that is a computer in a wireless device. So in this new environment, a number of things are happening that deeply affect the institutions of power making and wealth making. And here we have to remind which are still the fundamental logics of these institutions. Institutions in general in society are organized around the state. And productivity and the source of wealth in our societies is organized around capital. State and capital are still the cornerstones of our social organization. So they still dominate anything that happens even in the new technological environment. Although one of the critical matters about the internet is that the users of the internet have shaped the actual technologies and content of the internet use throughout their history. Both state and capital, however, operate in a given technological environment in our societies, that is the digitization of everything. States seek to establish and maintain power. Capital seeks to increase profits. This has not changed. Power is maintained by the institutional control of communication, either governments or media controlled by big corporations. The maintenance of power requires extensive surveillance for competition with other states and for keeping order internally, while capital expansion depends on the relentless capacity of commodifying everything, transforming everything in a commodity that can be bought and sold. And again, in both processes, information and communication, meaning digital communication in our society, are essential. Indeed, the internet was characterized, and it is, as a technology of freedom, of free communication. And it is a technology of free communication because simply because those who designed the internet technologies in the 1960s, 70s, deliberately tried to design a technology that would be difficult to control. It's one of the greatest paradoxes of internet history, that even if the program that led to internet was financed by DARPA, the Defense Department of the United States Research Agency, they actually was not intended as a military use by any means. It was actually funding computer scientists working in designing new forms of computer communication. And at the beginning, they really didn't know what to use for. They tried to use it for using the spare capacity of computers to increase time that they could use the computers, so by sharing the capacity of idle computers. But very, very soon they derived toward other uses, and the most important first email list that are developed by the computer scientists, mainly in the university campuses, was about sharing science fiction movies and novels and the way to buy weed everywhere. This is the source of internet collaboration. However, through these technologies, and that's the critical point, technologies of freedom are only as free as they are used for freedom. But the fundamental transformation is that all communication became digitized and interconnected and created the basis for massive global digital surveillance, which is the most important expression of power in our society. Digital surveillance is comprehensive in an entirely integrated digital environment. It's what we call the digital exhaust. The digital exhaust means that all the information is connected and therefore can be treated as a system. The key issue is connecting credit cards, phone calls, computer activity, search history, ID numbers, financial transactions, email communication, social networking sites, and all the interaction in the social networking sites. Because there is the possibility of connecting everything with everything, there is also the possibility of surveilling, retrieving information, and organizing this information in the interest of those who surveil. So what has emerged, particularly in the last decade, is what I call a global surveillance bureaucracy whose major quantum leap took place after the 9/11 bombing of New York, because that created the basis for funding and legal support in the United States and then throughout the world of extraordinary powers given to the surveillance agencies, particularly in the United States, the NSA, the National Security Agency, but all major countries have strengthened the power of surveillance of their own agencies. GCHQ in the United Kingdom, it's probably the most sophisticated surveillance agency, and the BDN agency in Germany is also a powerful surveillance agency, and they are all connected. That's the important thing. They are all connected with France and Israel, etc. They are all connected. And the connection is extremely important because legislation, in some cases, forbids a surveillance agency to spy citizens of their own country. So what they do is very simple, and this is real life, not just examples. The French spy the Germans spy the French, and then they exchange information. So that's the most direct and important expression of the logic of power in the digital age, is the formation of a fundamentally a panopticon of extraordinary proportions in which everything is known by governments with very little judicial control, in fact. At the same time, there is a different process that comes not from the state, but from capital and the logic of profit, which is the commodification of information, whose most important effect is transforming consumers of communication, meaning everybody, into data. We are all data that become, and these data are key commodities. These data are at the basis of the business model of all the major internet companies, Google and others, in the sense that, as they say in Silicon Valley, if you are not paying for a service, you are paying with your data. You are the currency. And this goes into advertising, goes into political manipulation, goes into everything. But the most important thing is to retrieve the information from everybody. And here is a certain paradox, but it's a very important one, a defining one. Because communication is free communication, free in the sense that people can communicate with everybody, because of that, there has been a massive decentralization of communication. At the same time, there is a massive concentration of information, meaning all the major companies as well as governments concentrate information from what? From the massive practice of people communicating with everything and with everybody on a daily basis. So because we actually communicate everything, the information retrieval agencies can pick up all our information without any problem. Precisely because we are a highly communicated society, at the same time, there is a high level of monopoly of information, both by the state and by private companies. Yes, we have the notion that we have the rights, protecting rights in terms of digital privacy. Well, as you know, Scott McNealy, the founder and CEO of Sun Microsystems in 1999 already issued the famous statement, privacy in the digital age, get over it. There's absolutely no privacy. Yes, companies have privacy policies. For instance, Google has a privacy policy. Please go to the Google website and read what is the privacy policy of Google. I can tell you. The only information, this is citing, the only information Google reserves the right to obtain and process from its users is, the only one, name, address, location, email, phone number, credit card number, search history, browsing habits, purchases, and selected content of emails. Other than that, privacy is respected. This is the official privacy policy. I'm not being demagogic. I'm trying to be analytical always. So now we are moving into the direction of a new form of total networking and digitization, what is called in the pop culture the Internet of Things, meaning that what is connected increasingly is machines connecting machines with machines, connecting objects, and creating a hybrid network in which we are connected among humans, but each one of the humans are connected with objects, and these objects are connected among themselves. And the machines of different companies are organizing the connection according to their programs. Certainly, their programs are ultimately programmed by humans, but at the same time, the logic of this connection follows certain protocols, certain algorithms, that's the key. Algorithms are, in most cases, both for the governments and for companies, are secret, and these algorithms include criteria such as the ability of a given network to reprogram itself constantly according to some meta-program to make it more efficient, more comprehensive, and faster. So not that we are moving, this is not science fiction, I never do science fiction. What it is we already are in a world of not billions, but trillions of networks that all of them are programmed outside control, and all of them ultimately have their own logic, which is partly technological and partly linked to the interests of the state and of the large internet companies. Now, the state and companies interact through all kinds of technological, economic, and institutional cooperations. The companies have contracts for the surveillance agencies. The surveillance agencies make favors to the companies, but this is not exactly the same logic. In fact, during the key moment in which the National Security Agency was given all power to do everything they wanted, technologically they were not very advanced, particularly they were not able to break some of the encryption procedures. So they actually got most of the technology from the private sector, and particularly from the usual suspects, from Google, from Apple, from Facebook, and the companies that originally were developing the new communication technologies. But at the same time, there are some important contradictions, because if consumers start panicking about their total lack of privacy, then they could try to protect the information through the one procedure that companies fear the most, encryption and control by them. The battle over encryption is a fundamental battle because it's ultimately the only way in which we could protect ourselves. And the ability, the diffusion, massive diffusion of encryption capacity, which the technology would be common, but the actual code of each encrypted message would be different and controlled by the user, this is what panics governments and what panics companies. Now, companies fear that if they push too much in the logic of controlling and providing information of every one of us to governments, then the backlash could ruin their business model. That, remember, their business model is our voluntary delivery of our lives transformed into data, for this data to be sold and organized in the entire commercial world so that we can be targeted as consumers, we can predict it in terms of behavior. You go to some place, to a restaurant, they will know exactly your supposed culinary taste. The same thing with books, the same thing with travel, the same thing with everything. That's why companies, Amazon, among others, provide you with a list of the things that you are supposed to do because you have done in the past. So you become a linear program trajectory in which you are the reflection of yourself the rest of your life, and it's a very flexible programming. So you change habits, well, this is also goes into the program, and you are guided in the new direction. So the logic of power is not the same thing than the logic of commodity, because the logic of power, as the head of the National Security Agency of the United States said, well, you know, to find indications of a terrorist activity is in the world at large is like finding a needle in a haystack. So to do that, I need the entire haystack, meaning the entire set of information everywhere, and then the programs can work. But this is the logic of power. Again, it's not the logic of commercialization and commodity, so there are contradictions, and even in some cases, companies like Apple have resisted. In other cases, Mark Zuckerberg has led a movement to stop the government of forcing the transmission of data. And in other cases, companies simply play this game of resisting and cooperating depending on moments. So it's a complex logic, it's an interactive logic, it's not the same, there are two different logics, but the two logics together control the entire information system on which our life depends. Which are the consequences of this? Well, first of all, democracy is threatened by comprehensive surveillance because there is asymmetry between the surveillors and the surveilled. Meaning, state and companies have access to information, to the uses of information, and the users don't. So it's one fundamental difference in asymmetry in our society. Privacy is, of course, obliterated by the commodification of data without consent. So this analysis and this logic apparently moves toward the so-called Orwellian universe of Big Brother controlling everything. Fortunately, things in history and in our society as well are more complicated because people have their will and their capacity. And even if they don't know technology, they have a passion for their freedom in general terms. And institutions of society are not one-dimensional institutions. They are the result of historical struggles between control and resistance to control. So, wherever there is surveillance and wherever there is breaching of privacy, there is also counter-surveillance and the defense of privacy, operating along various lines of action, such as there are a number of legal regulations dependent on the institutions, political, judicial institutions. For instance, there is more protection in the European Union than in the United States by far, let alone in China. However, both state and capital tend to counter the autonomy of these institutions. This unstable balance depends on policy choices. And ultimately, there is, in the case of government, there is always one key argument: national emergency, security, in a world threatened by terrorism, in a world in which the powers of governments are constantly increased. There is always the possibility to activate some legislation which goes through the judicial authority, like FISA in the United States, to obtain permission, and with the judicial permission, then they can operate legally with total control of information. How this works? Very easy. FISA has a number of judges, and I could tell something similar about Europe, a number of judges which are accredited by FISA, judges that are in principle independent judges. But statistically speaking, no one single decision by the National Security Agency has been reversed by a FISA judge, not one in the last 20 years that the institution existed. So national security and emergency had become the cover of every attempt to curtail the liberty and privacy that democratic societies in principle have. But again, there are still a number of judicial and legal protections that limit the power of surveillance. Also, technologies of privacy protection, encryption and others, which hackers continue to develop every day as a way to resist the control and the monopoly of information. There are also a number of activities by legal social activism, a number of organizations, such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Greenpeace, and others, that try to show the limits of the surveillance power. For instance, Greenpeace was able to detect the location of the repository of data, of clandestine data by the National Security Agency in a remote area of Bluffdale, Utah, and then flew a blimp over the repository, Greenpeace blimp, with an arrow saying, there are the data of your illegal spying, which of course created a whole uproar. In other words, and the Electronic Frontier Foundation files constant lawsuits against the United States. The same thing in the European Union. Multiple actions as well as in the UK, multiple actions of legal defense against the system. Hackers have developed all kinds of technology networks to protect free communication and freedom of information in this particular context. For instance, the network constructed originally from Sweden but later expanded to other places, to other countries, Tor, the onion router, that, for instance, was able to maintain internet working partly in Egypt in 2011, during the time Egypt canceled the internet, or tried to cancel the internet for 5 days until they gave up because they were not able to. Then a very important activity of the whistleblowers, like Snowden and others. Snowden is only the last one, but there were many others within the security agencies of the United States and of the European Union. People who, out of principle, decide that they have to denounce what's going on. Snowden, what happened with him is that he knew what happened to those who were whistleblowers before him, who were literally damaged for life in terms of persecution, in terms of confiscation of their goods, of their homes, or their everything. They were ruined forever. So he prepared his exit way in advance to start his activities of collecting data about what the NSA was doing as part of a heroic mission to respond to this kind of activity against the principles of the American democracy. Of course, he ended up in a Moscow suburb, so everybody has concluded that he was a Russian spy from the beginning. It was not such. He tried to do something else. He tried to ask for political asylum in some of the democratic regimes in Latin America. Particularly, he was trying to go to Ecuador, but he couldn't. He couldn't because once he was in Moscow, escaping from Hong Kong, every flight in which he was suspected that he could be, including the flight of President of Bolivia, Evo Morales, would be intercepted over the European airspace to search the plane to detain Snowden. So at one point, just simply he couldn't move at all. And so he's still there. And I would guess that at one point the Russian influence starts being significant, but was not the origin of his resistance. And as well as the very controversial case but important, of WikiLeaks, in which they are not the whistleblowers, but they publicize and they distribute throughout the world the informations of illegal or not public activities from governments and companies that should be known by the citizens, but they are not. They are not. So, in other words, this is to show that the more we go deeply into this system of systematic surveillance and breaching of liberties and privacy, at the same time, in many different ways, individuals, organizations, social activists, technological activists react and create a counter dynamics which is different. Moreover, there has been the rise nowadays, of what is known as citizen journalism, using surveillance technology to surveil the surveillors and to surveil those abuses of power, from police brutality to financial wrongdoing. Today, one of the most important transformations is that anyone with a cell phone, with a camera, meaning all the cell phones practically, can surprise some personality, some bureaucrat, some politician, some leader of a company, anyone doing something wrong or ethically wrong or legally wrong, and can take the picture and upload it immediately. And that starts a whole process of denunciation, protest, and sometimes legal action. This is what social movements these days do systematically against police brutality everywhere. That's an incredible instrument of control. That's why every time that people start talking about, well, we are in a terror state because all this surveillance comes upon our life. Yes, but I can tell you that politicians these days, when they do not behave, and many of them don't, they live their lives underground. You know, most of their lives, they spend their time making sure that nobody sees them, that nobody knows about their financial deals, etc., etc., etc. So it's both. It's both. We surveil and we counter-surveil all the time. And then, of course, there is a fundamental change that has taken place in social movements around the world with these particular technologies. Has been the rise of what I have studied lately of network social movement. That is, social movements that start outside the traditional political parties and traditional institutions, and that they organize their own connection on the basis of a spontaneous uprising, usually triggered by outrage and not necessarily by ideology. And then from there they grow into major social movements, such as Occupy, even a number of years of the Spanish 15 of May movement, and movements all over the world, in Latin America, in Asia, even in Africa. So the social movements of our time are movements in which the capacity to organize their own communication networks on the basis of their own ideas and their own outrage, share with others, without necessarily having an organization, without having a common ideology, without having a common project. This has been completely transformed thanks to their capacity to use a free communication system to bypass the traditional controls. Now, as you know, a number of people, but usually traditional media and as well as the politicians of all kinds have downplayed the importance of these movements, saying, well, they get tired, they produce nothing. Well, in my book, Networks of Outrage and Hope, I showed a number of key examples of actual political change and political transformation in many countries linked to the ripple effects, to the second-level effects of these social movements, which that do not happen in one day, because they are not violent movements in any way, but permeate, they use the transformation through the minds of the people. So the process is social movements organize themselves on the basis of horizontal new forms of free communication, networks based on the internet and wireless communication. In their action, symbolic action, sometimes it's through the internet, but mainly is through the combination of internet and occupation of urban space and the connection between the two sets of networks, urban networks and internet networks. On the basis of this, they create what I call a space of autonomy. This space of autonomy is the beginning of the ability to connect with other people who are equally outraged, and at the same time start deliberation and process to provide alternative projects in society without going through the same traditional channels of political organization. All right, these movements, through their action, even if they don't seize power in sense of occupying the state, what they do is they influence the transformation of consciousness in the minds of people, as has always been the role of social movements. Social movements are fundamentally aiming at changing the values of society, as the environmental movement, as the feminist movement, as the identity movement of many different kinds. So the same thing with this kind of network social movements. Through their action, the minds of the people change, and eventually, in some cases, political changes also happen at the level of the institutions. An example of this is the transformation of the Spanish political system through the actions of the parties that resulted from the 15 May movement, particularly the so-called Podemos, which now controls about 20% of the Spanish vote, or the most recent example, because I like also to show the examples that happen with some effects after 3, 4, 5 years after the movement. The example in the Chilean presidential election, in which the leaders of the student movement of 4 years ago now decided to create a new party because neither the right or the center-left respond to their aspirations, and in the first election they have obtained over 20% of the vote, and therefore they are becoming the arbiters of the new election, the new presidential election in Chile. And for you to see, the leaders of the movement were so young that they could not reach the legal age to be president. So they have to ask a friend, a nice woman, could you be our presidential candidate, because we cannot if we win. So in other words, the connection goes through communication networks that creates a process of mobilization that ultimately affects not just the people who are in the movement, but the society at large. For instance, in the case of Spain, there were 70% of the population was in agreement with this movement. In the case of the United States, against what is considered the failure of the Occupy Wall Street movement, it actually had a significant success and obtained a support of about 1/3 of the population in terms of the support the movement, and the hostility only of 20% of the population. They were significant in changing the public opinion, particularly among the young people of America. Now, when someone would say, well, okay, so what a nice political effect, Trump. Point is, the Trump, as much as one can say, the mystery of this ignorant, sexist, racist, arrogant, narcissist guy becoming president of the United States has to be understood as a reaction against the establishment of both the Republicans and the Democrats. That what made possible the election of Trump. But on the other hand, there was also another anti-establishment candidate in the Democratic Party that had serious chances, and in fact the studies show that he would have beaten Trump in the general election. Bernie Sanders, senator, who was part of the Occupy movement, literally part, being in the camps of the Occupy movement, and therefore triggered a huge mobilization among the young people that was crushed in the process of nomination by the bureaucratic apparatus of the Democratic Party. To present, in the most unbelievable mistake in politics, to present the super establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton, financial establishment and political establishment, against the anti-establishment candidate. So even with that, Trump being as he is, Hillary won the popular vote by 2 million, but Trump concentrated his support in key states where the working class had been hurt by globalization, and he was able to win. But Bernie Sanders would have won in these same states and was actually pushed out of the race by their own Democratic Party establishment. This is not to go now into this electoral analysis, it's to show that there were also important effects of the network social movements in the political system, even in the United States. I could go country after country. When there was a movement, it doesn't mean that because there were no movements in all countries. When there was a movement, that had a significant effect. Now, these social movements could not have existed without the capacity to communicate through digital networks of communication. Absolutely not. Could be some protest, but what they did was possible because of these new communication technologies. Problem is, of course, that they were able to do so, but at the same time, they were somewhat prisoner of the network technologies that existed. They communicated through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, etc. However, they are very conscious of that, and they have developed a series of new technologies of communication that could be encrypted and not controlled by, for instance, Facebook, just in case toward the future. Particularly, they developed some technology, encrypted technology called N-1. The problem is that very limited, works very well in a small networks, but not in large networks, but a number of other experiences. And ultimately, all these movements are massively using a different kind of networking technology, Telegram, that was developed in Germany by Russian hackers that immigrated from Russia, but work on the possibility of generating encrypted technologies for the communication of social movements independent from the other major institutions. So internet ultimately has shown its potential as a space of free expression and disintermediation of communication control. That's why the defense of internet freedom has become one of the fundamental political battles throughout the world. Because, of course, internet in itself cannot be controlled, but it can be intercepted in many ways, and also those who propose messages that are anti-establishment in the internet can be identified, for instance in China, and punished. However, I always say, having studied in depth the Chinese system of control, that yes, the messenger can be identified and punished and sent to prison, and there are many, many, many hundreds of Chinese activists in jail. However, the message cannot be intercepted. The message as such would have to be intercepted in the entire internet network, and this is literally impossible. So if you are the messenger, that's important, but if you are the message, you can go on and live and communicate and diffuse. And in that sense, internet is a space of free communication. Free communication doesn't mean the kind of freedom for the uses that we would like in normative terms. The Trump movement was very active in organizing networks of racist and sexist mobilizations, and the same thing in Germany with the neo-Nazi parties, an alternative for Germany, etc., etc. So the fact the internet has free communication, it doesn't mean that this is for the good uses according to each one's taste. It's for whatever happens in society. Internet is the mirror of society. How good or how bad society is, each one of us, that is immediately reflected in the internet. So the key question is not about if technology is good or bad, because it's not. As the great historian of technology, Marvin Krasberg, said, technology is neither good or bad, neither it is neutral. Meaning what? That is very important, but the effects are undetermined. Internet is used to be and is a free communication system, but the uses of this freedom are socially determined. Social media, social networks now are largely taking over the communication space and largely pushing aside the mass media. Mass media were not always reliable, were not always the best system of communication, and not always as truthful as they want to say they are. For instance, remember the great New York Times reporting the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, helping to trigger the war. But to a large extent, the most important thing now is not the replacement of one system by another, but what I call a general cacophony of information and ideas in the social networks. The period of post-truth, they call now lies are called post-truth. So everything is there, lies, bots that multiply by hundreds and thousands the fake news that are circulating in the internet and in the social networks. Can we do something about that? Yes and no, because technologically, even if some of the bots programs can be deactivated, by fake news is literally impossible to control if people produce fake news, if people pollute the information over the internet. So the only answer is the ability of educated citizens, informed citizens, to actively participate in these exchanges and correct the information and correct the ideas according to their experience, to their values, and to their interests. And I finish. The issue is that in a new technological environment, which I have tried to show the historical novelty, we still have the oldest social struggle. We still have the struggle against the abuses of power from the state and the exploitation from monopoly companies. And this struggle continues to be and will continue to be in defense of the freedom and dignity of the humankind. New technologies, old issues, old forms of oppression, and all new forms of struggle and response to the oppression. Thank you for your interest.